1649. A man arrived in Ireland and in 2 years tore open a wound that would bleed for centuries. In England, they called him a hero, the champion of liberty and Protestant England. In Ireland, they called him a butcher, a war criminal whose name still carries the weight of horror. At Drogheda, 3,500 people died in a single day. Soldiers, civilians, priests, cut down without mercy. And that was just the beginning. This is the story of Oliver Cromwell's Irish campaign. And what you're about to discover will force you to confront one of the most controversial figures in British history. A man who established parliamentary democracy at home while conducting what some call genocide abroad. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a campaign that most British people would rather forget, but one that shaped Ireland for centuries and still poisons relations between the two nations. Because Cromwell's Irish campaign wasn't just about military conquest, it was about religion, revenge, land confiscation, and the deliberate destruction of an entire society. And understanding what happened in those 2 brutal years is essential to understanding why Ireland and England would never truly be at peace again. But before we get to the killing fields of Drogheda, before we watch Cromwell's army storm through Ireland, leaving destruction in its wake, we need to understand how England and Ireland reached this point, because without knowing the political and religious forces that made this campaign not just possible, but celebrated in England, you can't truly appreciate the horror of what followed. Let's go back to 1641, when Ireland erupted in rebellion against English Protestant settlers who'd been taking Catholic land for decades. The native Irish and Old English Catholics rose up, and in the chaos that followed, thousands of Protestant settlers were killed. Reports, wildly exaggerated by English propaganda, claimed that over 100,000 Protestants had been massacred. The real number was probably around 4,000, still horrific, but the exaggerated tales spread through England like wildfire. English Protestants were convinced that Irish Catholics had perpetrated genocide. Pamphlets circulated showing priests torturing Protestant children. Stories spread of pregnant women being murdered, of families burned alive in their homes. Whether these atrocities happened exactly as described is almost beside the point. What mattered was that Protestant England believed them absolutely, and they wanted revenge. But England couldn't respond immediately because England was tearing itself apart in civil war. King Charles I, who'd been negotiating with Irish Catholics for military support against Parliament, faced Cromwell's new model army. The English Civil War had to be won before anyone could deal with Ireland. And when Parliament finally defeated the Royalists at Naseby in 1645, when Charles I was tried and executed in 1649, the new English Republic turned its attention to Ireland with the fury of long-delayed vengeance. Ireland in 1649 was a patchwork of competing factions. The Catholic Confederation controlled much of the island. An uneasy alliance of native Irish and Old English Catholics, royalist forces, still loyal to the executed king's son, held some territories. Protestant settlers clung to their strongholds, waiting for English relief. It was chaos, but it was also an opportunity. Cromwell saw Ireland not just as a military problem, but as a political solution. Conquering Ireland would serve multiple purposes. It would punish Catholic rebels for the 1641 uprising. It would eliminate the royalist threat from Ireland. It would provide land to pay soldiers who'd fought for Parliament. And perhaps most importantly, it would demonstrate to Europe that the new English Republic was a formidable military power. Cromwell intended to make Ireland an example. He succeeded beyond even his own brutal expectations. In August 1649, Cromwell landed in Ireland with 12,000 men, the cream of the new model army, veterans who'd crushed the king's forces at Naseby and defeated every enemy they'd faced. These were professional soldiers, disciplined, fanatical, convinced they were doing God's work. Cromwell had promised Parliament that Ireland would be conquered quickly and thoroughly. He kept that promise. His first target was Drogheda, a walled town on the east coast held by Royalist and Catholic forces under Sir Arthur Aston. Drogheda was strategically vital, controlling the route north from Dublin. But it was also symbolic. A quick, brutal victory at Drogheda would send a message to every garrison in Ireland: surrender or face total destruction. Cromwell's army surrounded Drogheda in early September. He offered the garrison terms: surrender and be spared, or resist and face the consequences. Aston, a Catholic royalist, refused. He had about 3,000 defenders, soldiers and armed townspeople, behind strong walls. He believed Drogheda could hold until relief arrived. He was catastrophically wrong. On September 11th, 1649, Cromwell's artillery breached the walls. His assault troops, carrying scaling ladders and grenades, rushed the gaps. The defenders fought desperately, throwing back the first assault with heavy casualties. Cromwell personally rallied his men, leading them back to the breach. The second assault broke through. What followed was not battle. It was slaughter. Cromwell had given orders that no quarter was to be shown. Every man bearing arms would be killed. His soldiers, enraged by their earlier losses and inflamed by propaganda about Catholic atrocities, obeyed with religious fervor. They swept through Drogheda, killing every soldier they found. Sir Arthur Aston, the garrison commander, was beaten to death with his own wooden leg, which soldiers believed contained hidden gold. His second-in-command was killed trying to surrender. Officers who threw down their weapons and begged for mercy were cut down where they stood. Soldiers who fled to churches hoping for sanctuary were burned alive when Cromwell's men set the buildings on fire. But the killing didn't stop with soldiers. Priests were specifically targeted. Cromwell saw Catholic clergy as the source of Irish rebellion, poisoning the people against Protestant England. Every priest found in Drogheda was executed. Some were killed in their churches. Others were hunted through the streets. The exact number of priests killed is unclear, but contemporary accounts speak of numerous clergy among the dead. And then there were the civilians. This is where history becomes uncomfortable, where defenders of Cromwell and his critics diverge most sharply. Cromwell himself claimed he'd only killed men bearing arms and that any civilian deaths were collateral damage. His critics, both contemporary and modern, say civilians were deliberately targeted, that women and children died alongside soldiers. The truth is probably somewhere between, but that truth is still horrific. In the chaos of a sacked city, with soldiers convinced that every Catholic was complicit in the 1641 massacres, the line between combatant and civilian blurred into nothing. People died trying to flee. They died hiding in cellars. They died begging for mercy that never came. The total death toll at Drogheda was approximately 3,500, perhaps 2,800 soldiers and 700 civilians, though the exact numbers will never be known. Cromwell was unapologetic. He wrote to Parliament describing the massacre as a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. He saw Drogheda not as a war crime, but as divine justice, punishment for the 1641 rebellion. And crucially, Parliament agreed. In England, Drogheda wasn't condemned. It was celebrated. Bonfires were lit. Thanksgiving services were held. The massacre was seen as God's vengeance on Catholic rebels. A month later, Cromwell proved Drogheda was no accident. At Wexford, another coastal town, he repeated the pattern. After breaching the walls, his troops went on another rampage. Between 1,500 and 2,000 people died. Again, a mixture of soldiers, civilians, and priests. Churches were sacked. The town's economy, based on fishing and trade, was destroyed. Wexford, like Drogheda, became a byword for Cromwell's brutality. But here's what made Cromwell's campaign so effective, so terrifying. After Drogheda and Wexford, resistance collapsed. Garrison after garrison surrendered rather than face the same fate. Towns opened their gates to Cromwell's army without firing a shot. The message had been received: resist and die, surrender and live. It was a strategy of terror, and it worked brilliantly from a military standpoint. By 1650, Cromwell had secured the East Coast and much of southern Ireland. He returned to England in May 1650 to deal with a Scottish invasion, leaving his generals to finish the conquest. But the pattern he'd established continued: systematic conquest, brutal sieges, terror as policy. By 1653, Ireland was entirely under English control. The military conquest, brutal as it was only the beginning. What followed was arguably worse: the Cromwellian settlement, a program of land confiscation and population transfer on a scale Ireland had never seen. Catholic landowners, even those who hadn't rebelled, had their estates confiscated. They were given a choice: move west to Connaught, the poorest region of Ireland, or face execution. To hell or to Connaught became the bitter summary of their options. Thousands of Catholic landowners were dispossessed. English Protestant soldiers and investors received the confiscated land. Ireland's entire landholding class was transformed. Before Cromwell, Catholics owned about 60% of Irish land. After the settlement, they owned less than 20%. It was the largest forced transfer of property in Irish history, and its effects would shape Ireland for centuries. Here's a question worth considering. If you were an English soldier who'd fought for Parliament, who'd been promised land for your service, and you were given a confiscated Irish estate, would you have refused on moral grounds? Or would you have taken it, told yourself you'd earned it, that the previous owners were rebels who got what they deserved? It's easy to judge from centuries away, but put yourself in 1653. What would you have done? Drop your thoughts below. But the settlement wasn't just about land. It was about breaking Catholic Ireland permanently. Catholic worship was suppressed. Priests were hunted. Catholic schools were closed. The goal was to make Ireland Protestant, English, and obedient. It failed in the first objective. Ireland remained stubbornly Catholic, but succeeded in the others, at least for a time. The demographic impact was staggering. Historians estimate that during Cromwell's campaign and its aftermath, Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 850,000. Some died in battle. More died from disease and famine as armies destroyed crops and livestock. Thousands were transported as indentured servants to the West Indies, effectively sold as slaves. Others fled to Europe, joining Catholic armies on the continent. It was a catastrophe on a scale Ireland wouldn't see again until the Great Famine 2 centuries later. Yet in England, Cromwell remained a hero. He'd conquered Ireland cheaply and quickly. He'd made it safe for Protestant settlers. He'd punished Catholic rebels, and he'd proven that England's new model army could defeat any enemy. The English saw Cromwell's Irish campaign as a triumph. They would continue to see it that way for centuries. In Ireland, memory took a very different path. Cromwell became the embodiment of English oppression, a symbol of Protestant brutality and Catholic suffering. Stories of his atrocities were passed down through generations. His name became a curse, invoked to explain Irish hatred of England. The curse of Cromwell became a common Irish oath, wishing upon someone the destruction Cromwell had brought to Ireland. Modern historians debate Cromwell's Irish campaign endlessly. Was Drogheda a war crime by 17th century standards? Cromwell's defenders say no. The rules of war at the time allowed, even encouraged, the sacking of towns that refused surrender. Drogheda had been offered terms and refused. What followed, while brutal, was standard military practice of the era. Cromwell's critics respond that even by 17th century standards, the killing went too far, that targeting priests violated norms of sanctuary, that killing civilians was never acceptable, that Cromwell's own religious fanaticism led him to commit atrocities that more moderate commanders would have prevented. So, here's the real question. Can you judge historical figures by the standards of their time? Or should universal moral principles apply across centuries? If Drogheda was acceptable in 1649, does that make it acceptable? Or are some acts wrong regardless of when they occurred? And who gets to decide? It's a question without easy answers, but it's worth wrestling with. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. The debate is complicated by Cromwell's paradoxical legacy. In England, he's remembered as the man who defended Parliament against tyranny, who established the principle that even kings must obey the law. He's a complex figure in English history, authoritarian yet democratic, brutal yet principled. Schools, streets, and pubs are named after him. His statue stands outside Parliament. In Ireland, there's no ambiguity. Cromwell is simply evil, a genocidal maniac who tried to destroy Irish Catholic culture. No statues honor him. His name is synonymous with occupation and oppression. The divide in how England and Ireland remember Cromwell is itself evidence of the wound he opened, a wound that never really healed. What makes Cromwell's Irish campaign so significant isn't just the body count, though that's horrific enough. It's the systematic nature of the conquest and dispossession. It's the religious dimension. Protestant England, crushing Catholic Ireland, in the name of God. It's the land confiscation that created a Protestant ruling class that would dominate Ireland for centuries. And it's the memory, the way these events became foundational to Irish identity and Irish-English relations. The effects rippled forward through history. The Protestant ascendancy that ruled Ireland for 200 years was built on Cromwellian land grants. The penal laws that suppressed Catholics for generations were justified by the threat of Catholic rebellion. With 1641 and Cromwell's response constantly invoked, the Irish independence movement of the 19th and 20th centuries drew on memories of Cromwell to fuel resistance to British rule. Even today, Cromwell's campaign matters. When discussions of Irish history come up, Cromwell is there. When English-Irish relations are strained, his ghost is invoked. In 2021, the 375th anniversary of Drogheda, debates raged about whether Britain should apologise for the massacre. Some said yes, seeing it as a necessary reckoning with colonial history. Others said no, arguing you can't judge 17th century warfare by modern standards. Today, Drogheda is a thriving town north of Dublin, but the real memorial is in memory, in the stories Irish families still tell about Cromwell, in the way his name still carries weight centuries after his death. The walls Cromwell breached are gone. The churches where people died have been rebuilt or replaced. But walk through Drogheda, mention Cromwell's name, and you'll see the history isn't dead. It's very much alive, passed down through generations. A wound that time hasn't healed because it was never properly acknowledged. Yet Cromwell remains largely forgotten in British popular history. Ask most English people about him, and they'll mention the Civil War, the execution of Charles I, maybe his role as Lord Protector. Ask about Ireland, and you'll get blank looks. The campaign that dominates Irish historical consciousness barely registers in English memory. That disconnect is itself part of the problem, part of why reconciliation remains incomplete. But Drogheda and Wexford deserve to be remembered, not because the massacres were unique. 17th century warfare was brutal everywhere, not because Cromwell was uniquely evil. He was a product of his time and beliefs, but because what happened in Ireland in 1649 to 1653 shaped two nations' relationship for centuries, created wounds that still haven't healed, and demonstrated something important about how colonial violence, even when celebrated at home, leaves scars that endure. That's what makes Cromwell's Irish campaign matter today. Not the tactics or the sieges or even the body count, though all of that is important, but what it shows about how one nation's hero can be another's monster. How religious fanaticism can justify atrocity. How land confiscation and cultural suppression can poison relations for centuries. How memory divides as much as it unites. Within 15 years of landing in Ireland, Cromwell would be dead. His republic collapsed, monarchy restored. Within 40 years, new wars would rage over Ireland. Within 2 centuries, Ireland would be fighting for independence. The wound Cromwell opened never closed. It just kept bleeding, generation after generation, into the modern era. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the uncomfortable truths, the forgotten atrocities, the moments when heroes become villains depending on which side of the Irish Sea you stand, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told, no matter how difficult No matter whose heroes they tarnish. What other dark chapters of British history should we uncover? The Scottish Highland clearances, the conquest of Wales, the colonial campaigns that built the empire. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.